Respect costs nothing, but one careless insult cost a billionaire everything in front of his peers. The clinking of silverware, the low murmur of polite laughter, and the faint aroma of roasted salmon drifted through the banquet room at the Cipriani Wall Street restaurant in Manhattan. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into after work. It was the kind of room where the price of one bottle of wine could cover someone's rent for 2 months. The ceilings were high, the chandeliers heavy with gold trim, and the tables filled with people who wore success like it was part of their skin. And right at the center of it all sat Victor Callahan. If you lived in the world of business, you knew his name. If you didn't, you still probably used something his company touched. He was one of those billionaire CEOs who had made his fortune in global shipping and technology logistics, always on the cover of some financial magazine with a smug grin and a quote about innovation that someone else probably came up with for him. Victor was the kind of man who walked into a room and sucked the air out of it. He laughed a little too loud, gestured a little too wide, and carried himself as if the room was lucky to have him in it. And tonight, surrounded by bankers, investors, and fellow executives, he was in rare form. But the real story of that evening didn't begin at his table. It began with someone carrying a tray. Amani Brooks moved quickly, her eyes scanning the table to make sure she didn't miss anyone's order. She wasn't nervous, but she was careful. That mattered in a place like this, where one spilled glass of Bordeaux could ruin not just a customer's suit, but possibly her job. Her black hair was pulled neatly into a bun, her apron pressed, her notepad tucked just behind the tray she balanced like it was nothing. To most of the room, she was invisible. That's how it always went. The staff moved around like shadows, filling glasses and clearing plates, existing only when needed and vanishing just as quickly. But to one man, she would become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Victor watched her approach with a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His companions leaned in as if expecting another story from him, one of his infamous, sharp-edged jokes. But instead of another tale about a deal he crushed or a rival he humiliated, he found his entertainment in the woman standing quietly at his side. "Careful with that, sweetheart," Victor said in English first, his tone dripping with the kind of fake charm that's meant to put someone beneath you. Then he turned his head slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep his words private. And in Arabic, he added a phrase that drew chuckles from the men at his table. They laughed because they knew Amani couldn't possibly understand him. At least, that's what they thought. Amani didn't flinch. She didn't break stride. She set down the glass in front of him with steady hands, the picture of professionalism. On the outside, she looked the same as she always did, calm, focused, polite. But inside, she caught every word. Victor leaned back in his chair, enjoying the small ripple of amusement he'd created. He expected her to blush, to smile awkwardly, to walk away without a clue. Instead, she turned her head ever so slightly, locked eyes with him, and opened her mouth. But before we get there, you need to understand this. Moments like these, the ones that start small and casual, are the ones that explode into something no one forgets. They begin with one person underestimating another. They end with everyone in the room questioning what just happened. And this was about to be one of those nights. But Victor wasn't ready for the silence that would follow his laughter, and the reply that would flip the entire room upside down. Victor Callahan thrived in places like this. Rooms where the linen was starched, where the waiters wore suits sharper than most men's wedding tuxedos, and where a single nod from him could decide whether someone's idea lived or died. He liked being watched. He liked being listened to even more. At his table, 6 men and 2 women leaned forward, hanging on his every word. They weren't just colleagues, they were orbiters. People who knew that proximity to power could be more valuable than any degree or resume. When Victor laughed, they laughed. When he gestured dramatically, they nodded as if he had just rewritten the rules of the universe. "You know the problem with people in this city?" Victor said, swirling his glass of Pinot Noir as though it were part of his performance. "They think small. They dream about opening a little shop, making a little money. That's fine for them, but not for me. I don't just think about New York or the States. I think globally. My competition isn't the guy across the street. It's the billionaire sitting in Geneva or Dubai who's ready to outmaneuver me at 2 a.m. His voice carried across the table, bouncing off the tall walls of Cipriani. 2 tables over, a young couple paused their own conversation, clearly drawn to his booming presence. Victor didn't mind. He liked the idea that strangers might walk out of here tonight, telling their friends they'd seen him in the flesh. One of the men beside him, a venture capitalist named Richard Hanley, chimed in. Victor, that's why you're always 10 steps ahead. You don't let yourself get distracted by the noise. Victor smirked, leaning back. Exactly. That's why I'm sitting here with a company valued at $47 billion and climbing, while half my rivals are struggling to keep their offices open. They're worried about what's fair. I'm worried about what's possible. The table erupted in polite laughter. It wasn't really funny, but it didn't have to be. People laughed because he expected it. Victor thrived on that. But what no one else realized was how quickly his sharp edges turned cruel. He didn't just joke. He cut. He found the smallest crack in someone's armor and dug into it for sport. And tonight, as his gaze drifted back toward Imani Brooks, he found the perfect opportunity. See, he said, nodding slightly in her direction. This is what I mean. You have people like us, and then you have... He let his words trail off, his smirk doing the heavy lifting. Well, let's just say there are people who serve, and people who are served. The chuckles came again, awkward but obedient. Imani didn't look at him. She simply adjusted the tray in her hands and moved with the precision of someone who'd heard 1,000 versions of the same thing before. To her, this was just another man flexing his ego in public. But to Victor, she wasn't just background noise. She was a target. He leaned toward Richard, speaking in Arabic now. His words weren't loud, but they were clear enough for the men and women closest to him to catch. It was a biting remark, one that cast Imani as less than him, less than them, meant only for their amusement. And they laughed again. Victor grinned, confident. This was the part he loved, the tiny victories no one else questioned. He didn't think twice about whether she understood. Why would he? In his world, waitresses didn't grow up traveling between Cairo and Washington. They didn't speak multiple languages. They didn't carry secrets in silence. Victor thought he owned the moment. But power is fragile, and arrogance has a way of cracking it wide open. But just as he was about to move on to his next lesson, Imani decided the time had come to show him exactly who he was dealing with. To most people in that glittering room, Imani Brooks was just another server gliding between tables. They saw the pressed uniform, the professional smile, and the practiced balance of trays, but they didn't see the story behind her eyes. She had learned early that people rarely looked past the surface. That suited her just fine. Imani was 27, working double shifts while finishing her graduate program at Columbia University. She studied international relations, a field she'd chosen partly because it felt like the world had always been part of her life. Her father had worked for the State Department, a man who spoke French in Paris, Arabic in Cairo, and Spanish in Madrid with the same effortless confidence. Her mother had been a school teacher, reminding her daily that knowledge was both a shield and a weapon. Imani had grown up crossing borders most kids only saw on maps. Summers spent in Morocco, school years split between Virginia and Egypt, teenage friendships made and lost in airports. By the time she was 16, she spoke English, French, and Arabic, like they were 3 different notes of the same song. Now, here she was, serving dinner to men who measured worth in net profits, not in experiences. She didn't mind the work. She was good at it, and the tips paid for textbooks that cost more than her monthly groceries, but she minded the way some people treated her. To them, her apron erased her story. It made her less. Still, she had learned not to take the bait. Most nights, she let arrogance roll past her like water off glass. But tonight was different. Tonight, Victor Callahan had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. She caught his smirk, caught the way his friends leaned toward him, caught the Arabic words that slipped so casually from his mouth. He had meant them as a private joke. He thought she wouldn't understand. She did, every syllable. And in that instant, something settled in her chest. She could let it slide, the way she had countless times before. Or she could speak. Her decision wasn't about pride. It wasn't about embarrassing him in front of his peers. It was about respect, something too many people thought they could deny her. As she adjusted the tray in her hands, she remembered her father's words the day he dropped her off at college. People will underestimate you. Don't waste energy proving them wrong every time. But when the moment comes, when it matters, show them exactly who you are. That moment had arrived. Imani set a glass carefully in front of Victor, her hands steady, her face calm. She didn't hurry, didn't blink, didn't give away that her reply was already forming on her tongue. Around her, the table was still buzzing with laughter, but when she lifted her eyes, just for a heartbeat, Victor caught a look he didn't expect. Not timid, not flustered, controlled, certain. The kind of look that made you realize the game was about to change. But Victor, smug and comfortable in his power, hadn't yet realized he had chosen the wrong person to underestimate. Victor leaned back in his chair, still savoring his own cleverness. He twirled the stem of his wineglass between his fingers, eyes flicking over Amani as if she were part of the decor instead of a living, breathing person. He didn't bother lowering his voice this time. He wanted his companions to hear him clearly. "She carries herself well," he said in Arabic, his tone mocking, "but she's still just here to take our plates." The table burst into quiet chuckles, the kind reserved for the kind of joke you knew wasn't appropriate but laughed at anyway. The kind of laughter that made people complicit, even when they didn't fully agree. Richard Hanley leaned closer, repeating the word Victor had used, mocking Amani's role in a way that made it sharper, uglier. Another executive at the table smirked and shook his head, as if to say, "Classic Victor." Victor grinned wider. "She probably doesn't even know what I just said," he added in Arabic, his words curling with arrogance. "Why would she? Arabic isn't a language for waitresses in New York." The laughter came again, thin and awkward this time. Some of them shifted in their seats, not quite comfortable with the harshness of it, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to risk losing Victor's favor. Amani heard it all. Each syllable landed like a challenge. Her father had taught her that language was more than words. It was identity, history, power. And here was a man using it like a weapon to make her smaller. For a split second, she considered walking away, keeping the mask on, pretending she hadn't understood. That would have been safer, easier, but something in her refused. She placed the final plate on the table with deliberate care, her hands steady even as her heart beat faster. Then she straightened her back, met Victor's smug grin with calm eyes, and answered him, in perfect, unbroken Arabic. "Strange," she said smoothly, her tone polite but edged with steel. "For a man who claims to think globally, you speak with the arrogance of someone who's never truly listened." The air changed instantly. Forks hovered mid-air, glasses paused just inches from lips. The laughter died so quickly, it felt like someone had cut the sound from the room. Victor froze, his smirk faltering as the words registered. He blinked once, then twice, as though his ears had betrayed him. The silence was heavy now, stretching long enough for Imani to shift her weight, long enough for the other guests at the table to glance at one another, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Richard let out a low whistle under his breath. "Did she just—" "Yes," one of the women whispered. "She understood every word." Imani didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't give them the satisfaction of gloating. She simply stood her ground, her tray tucked neatly at her side, waiting for the weight of her reply to sink in. Victor cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "Well," he said in English this time, trying to regain control, "looks like we've got ourselves a waitress with hidden talents." But no one laughed with him. The tables around them, once humming with conversation, had gone quiet too. People who hadn't caught the words could still feel the shift in the air, the sudden tension pulling everything tight. Imani inclined her head slightly, professional to the very end. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said in English, her voice even, her posture unshaken. And then she stepped back, letting the silence do the rest. Victor sat there, his face stiff, the weight of his arrogance settling on him for the first time all evening. But this was only the beginning, because what had started as a casual insult had just cracked open something much bigger, something even Victor couldn't control. Victor's laugh had always been his armor, loud, confident, dismissive, something he used to cover any crack in his control. But this time, it slipped. The chuckle came out forced, brittle, almost hollow. Everyone at the table heard the difference. Imani, meanwhile, hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her words in Arabic had been crisp, her tone calm, and that calmness was what unsettled everyone most. She wasn't rattled, she wasn't embarrassed. She was steady, composed, and suddenly, all eyes were on her instead of him. One of the women at the table, a hedge fund manager named Samantha Boyd, tilted her head, eyebrows lifted. "Victor," she said softly, "I thought you said she wouldn't understand." The question wasn't mocking, it was worse. It was genuine, and it landed like a stone dropped in water. Victor's jaw tightened. "Well," he said in English, trying to turn the tide back to humor, I guess we've all learned something new tonight. But Richard leaned forward, curiosity sparking. Wait, what exactly did she say to you? Victor hesitated, his eyes darting toward Amani, then back to Richard. Nothing important, he muttered. That was the moment Amani decided to speak again. Still in Arabic, her words flowed smoothly, her accent precise. I said it's strange for a man who claims to think globally to speak with the arrogance of someone who has never truly listened. The translation didn't need to be offered. Even those who didn't understand Arabic could feel the weight of her reply in the rhythm of her voice. The words carried dignity, authority. They didn't belong to a server. They belonged to someone who had stood in rooms of power before and knew how to hold her ground. Samantha's eyes widened. That's flawless, she whispered. A murmur rippled through the table. Someone asked where she had learned it. Another whispered about Cairo, about diplomats, about backgrounds they couldn't have guessed from the apron she wore. Victor's smile faltered completely. For the first time that night, he looked small, not in stature, but in certainty. His companions weren't laughing anymore. They weren't looking at him the same way. Some of them were staring at Amani with something close to admiration. Amani, is it? Samantha asked gently, her voice carrying enough for the table to hear. Amani gave the smallest nod. Yes, ma'am. And you speak Arabic fluently? Yes. Her answer was simple, but the confidence beneath it was undeniable. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and not for Amani, for Victor. His own words, his own arrogance, had been turned back on him in a way he couldn't joke his way out of. Someone at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Remarkable, he said, almost to himself. Victor shifted in his seat, tugged at his cufflinks, tried to regain his footing. Well, talent comes in all places, I suppose, he muttered, but his companions weren't buying it. They had seen the shift. They had felt it. For years, Victor had been the loudest voice in any room, but tonight, a single measured reply from someone he thought invisible had shaken his dominance. Amani, for her part, didn't linger. She collected the empty breadbasket, set it on her tray, and stepped back with the same professionalism she had started with. To anyone watching, it might have looked like nothing more than part of her routine. But everyone at that table knew different. But the most striking part wasn't her reply. It was what came next, when her story began to surface, and the room learned she wasn't just any waitress at all. The room hadn't just gone quiet. It had tilted. Power, that invisible weight Victor always carried with him, wasn't sitting on his shoulders anymore. It had slipped, almost without anyone noticing, onto Amani's. The executives at the table weren't looking at him the way they usually did. They weren't waiting for his next clever quip or smug observation. They were studying Amani, the waitress they hadn't even glanced at twice when she first arrived. Samantha was the first to speak again. That was impressive, she said, her tone curious, not condescending. Where did you learn Arabic like that? Amani hesitated for half a second, not because she was nervous, but because she had a choice to make. She could keep her story to herself, let her words linger as the final strike. Or she could pull back the curtain a little more, make them see her as more than the uniform she wore. My father was a diplomat, she said finally, her voice even. I grew up between Cairo and Washington. I've been speaking Arabic since I was a child. The words hung in the air. Richard blinked. A diplomat's daughter? Yes, she replied simply, and now a graduate student. I'm finishing my degree at Columbia. That detail landed harder than she expected. Several of the men exchanged looks, their expressions shifting from amusement to discomfort, then to something closer to respect. Samantha leaned forward, fascinated. What are you studying? International relations, Amani answered, with a focus on conflict resolution. There was no prideful tilt in her voice, no smugness. She wasn't trying to brag. She was just telling the truth. But that truth was heavy enough to press on the table like another plate of food. Victor tried to laugh it off. Well, he said, forcing a grin, looks like we've got ourselves an ambassador in training. Good for you. But no one echoed him this time. Instead, Richard spoke again, shaking his head slightly. Victor, you really didn't think she'd understand you? Victor's jaw worked. Why would I? The answer came out harsher than he intended, and he knew immediately it had been the wrong thing to say, because now it wasn't just about the joke. It was about the assumption, the arrogance. Samantha glanced at Amani, then back at Victor. That's the problem, isn't it? You assume. Victor bristled. Excuse me? You assume people are less than you. You assume they can't understand, can't keep up. And tonight, you assumed wrong. The words hit harder than anything Amani had said, because they came from inside his circle, from someone who had never challenged him publicly before. Amani didn't add anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was stronger than any follow-up. The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to Victor and the undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. A billionaire, a man who built his empire on confidence and dominance, had been humbled by a waitress with a tray and a second language. And the strangest part? No one pitied him. Amani excused herself quietly, stepping away from the table to continue her shift. To her, the moment was finished. She had answered the insult, revealed the truth, and done it without raising her voice. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She had walked in with dignity, and she would leave with it intact. Victor, on the other hand, sat in silence, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say, but silence has a way of echoing louder than words, and by the end of the night, Victor would realize this moment wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a lesson he couldn't ignore. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere at Victor's table had shifted completely. The laughter was thinner now, the conversation scattered, as if no one quite knew how to return to the easy rhythm they'd had before. Victor tried. He told a story about a merger in Singapore, threw in a half-hearted joke about jet lag, but it landed flat. The room hadn't forgotten what happened, and neither had he. Every time he glanced toward Amani, who now moved gracefully between other tables, he felt the sting of his own arrogance reflected back at him. She didn't look at him again, but she didn't have to. The damage was done. Samantha leaned over at one point, her voice low enough for only him to hear. You know, Victor, power isn't just about money or position. Sometimes it's about presence. And tonight, she had more of it than you. The words hit harder than she probably realized. Victor prided himself on control, on being untouchable. But tonight, he had been measured and found lacking. When the dinner finally wound down, the group stood to leave. They shook hands, exchanged polite goodbyes, and slipped into the Manhattan night with their drivers waiting outside. But the conversations they carried with them weren't about quarterly earnings or Victor's newest yacht. They were about Amani. Did you hear her accent? Flawless. A diplomat's daughter, can you believe that? She put him right in his place. Victor heard it all. Each word was another reminder that his careless arrogance had cost him something he couldn't buy back. Respect. Amani, meanwhile, finished her shift the way she always did. She cleared plates, thanked customers, and signed out quietly at the back office before stepping into the cool night air. To her, it wasn't about victory. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about standing tall when someone tried to make her small. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. When the moment comes, show them who you are. Tonight, she had. Victor sat in the back of his car as it pulled away, staring out at the glittering city. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, though his pride still burned. It wasn't humiliation, though that lingered too. It was something quieter, something that sounded dangerously close to reflection. Maybe Samantha was right. Maybe power wasn't just about commanding a room. Maybe it was about listening, about recognizing strength, even when it came from places you didn't expect. He didn't know if he was ready to admit it out loud, but he knew one thing. He would never forget the name Amani Brooks, and neither would anyone else at that table, because the lesson of that night was simple. Never underestimate the person in front of you. You don't know their story. You don't know their strength. And sometimes, the people you dismiss the fastest are the ones who will leave you speechless. So let this story remind you of something important. Respect costs you nothing, but disrespect can cost you everything. If this moment struck you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, talk about it, pass it forward. Because the world changes when we choose respect over arrogance, and when we remember that every single person we meet carries a story worth hearing.